Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Henry Guapo, and I'm a managing partner with Avasant. And it's my privilege to be here today with all you fine people in this great location, in person, to lead our discussion on what I think is a great and fascinating topic, and that is the digital core, next generation, cloud, and advanced networks. Now, I think this is a very important topic because if you think about it, almost every innovation and almost every business outcome that's been talked about during our sessions here, yesterday and today, are totally going to be powered by the topics we're going to be talked about today. Just think about this morning, Kevin's discussion on the Omniverse. Think about the computing power that's going to be required, the communications power that's going to be required for the omnipresence, for the constant data and immersive interactions that we're going to have in these different verses. Totally reliant on what we're going to be talking about today. Just yesterday, we talked about smart cities and hopefully helping out our Olympics in 2028, right? Implementing new technologies to help that whole experience go a lot smoother for the visitors and, of course, the participants. Bharat this morning talked about how he's transforming the shipbuilding industry, his shipyard, how he's making new experiences for his employees and the process for building ships, using the technologies, the practices, and the approaches that we're going to be talking about today with our guests. And there's three kind of layers that we'll be talking about in the infrastructure elements here. The first one is a highly scalable, highly connected, highly flexible edge to core network element. That's the first one. The second one is a high-powered core of cloud computing that's going to power all of these innovations we talked about. And the third one is really a software layer that's going to allow us to manage this very complex ecosystem using a software-defined approach. So those three things, we'll bring it all together, and our panelists will clue us in on what's happening today, what's going on in their industries and their experiences. We have, I think, a good, diverse group here who will have different perspectives. And I will introduce them. We have Naresh Lachmandas, former CIO, General Atomics, former CIO L3 at CSW, City of San Diego, and now currently my colleague, a partner with Avasant. We also have Vince Gutosky, who's Director of Network Engineering from CapitalOne. We have Andy Schley, Senior Vice President, Enterprise Technology, Sony Pictures. And Daniel Lawson, Vice President, Solutions Architecture, Verizon Business Group. So as you can see, a great group of panelists here to clue us in. So I'd like to start off with our first question, kind of high level, setting the context, okay? Naresh, you've been a CIO, number of organizations. Now you are consulting with a number of different clients, industries. What would you say are some of the drivers, trends? What are the things that are happening in these environments as you help them with their digital evolutions and help them prepare on how they think about the infrastructure?
Thank you, Henry, and good afternoon, everybody. So, Henry, in response to your question, I think if you look back at what Maher from CEMEX said this morning, and Bharat as well, it's really setting the foundation for this transformation, right? If you use the word layers, if you look at the old school model we all had of, I have my apps component and infrastructure and network, and we had that triangle on how IT organization was set up. In this new world with this hyper-convergence of the cloud, the hybrid cloud with edge computing devices and put all that together, we have to look at this more comprehensively as, I believe, a hyper-linked environment where you can't just look at one component, you have to look at all comprehensively together to provide that level of security like Bart brought about, but also help drive down costs as you go ahead as well. So to me, it's that. And that's where I feel some of the trends are as enterprises are looking ahead. Again, each company, each enterprise is in a different part of their journey, right? Some are starting, some are ahead. I think you're going to hear from some of our panelists today where they're moving ahead. And I think it's important for recognize that it's a different journey for everybody, but that's the trends that I'm observing.
And Vince, taking it one tick lower, in your industry, the banking industry, the financial products industry with CapitalOne, you were obviously at the forefront of a major transformation, right? What could be more important than a person and their money and their financial future, their credit cards, right? So what were some of the things that you experienced and some of the things you might be taking forward?
Well, you kind of nailed it, is when you talk about a customer's finances, and we really saw this during the pandemic around ATMs, that a lot of us don't really think about cash or our banking, it's there. But during the pandemic, it became even more apparent as we didn't have necessarily all of our branches staffed appropriately and there were long lines. It also drove home the fact that you really need resiliency in your applications. He just talked about the fact we have the Cypher conversion. We always thought about things singularly. As we moved to the cloud and we looked at our network infrastructure, compute, storage, everything else, it became less about those individual components and more about system access and being on all the time and having that resiliency. Because one of the biggest things that we notice in the cloud is that we're not just having a dependency on our own applications, we also have dependencies on other third parties and other applications. And as you go to the cloud, there's a huge difference in the way that you can connect to other companies and other areas. And so really thinking about the ecosystem from a resiliency standpoint and ensuring that every part of that application stack is working the way it is, as well as understanding the application dynamics. One of the biggest things that we've learned on our journey to the cloud is really just how many dependencies we have, not just on our own applications, but also third parties.
It's that full ecosystem, right?
Yes.
Dependencies are going across. Andy, the entertainment industries, the creative industries have always been on the forefront of using technology, right? We've seen that over decades. Are there any new areas where technology is pushing the industry in different areas or?
Well, yeah, I think it's interesting. The industry is at the forefront of adopting new technologies, particularly digital production. It's always moving. But what we haven't done a very good job of is tying that all together. And I think that is where the focus is moving now, is to have a flow of the content all the way from where it's handled in production with VFX through post-production to all the places where it's getting distributed, and having that as a continuous flow, instead of having it, oh, I'm done with the production, I deliver it. Oh, I've got to distribute, theaters, home entertainment, television, and so on. So really looking at that as an end-to-end flow, and we're getting to the point where these new technologies are going to enable us to do that.
I'm kind of hearing a theme of no more silos, end-to-end ecosystems, business partners. I assume those are different companies all within that process potentially?
Oh yeah, across the whole creative chain, everything in a movie production pretty much operates as its own little company with its own set of vendors that are doing either VFX or all the various content processing and everything down to catering. And that process continues throughout the whole life cycle and into the distribution side.
So now the heat's on you. Your industry and Verizon as a leader, and obviously in communications, enterprise products, solutions. Yep. What's your pipeline of products and services look like? What's the evolution to kind of address the things we've talked about here?
Yeah, so think about some of the words that Naresh used, for example, right? Foundation. Vince said ecosystem and systems, right? And end-to-end that Andy said. The products and services that we're bringing to market have to meet those needs, right? And it's a bit of a paradox when you think about a foundation. Anyone's ever had foundation work done on their home? This foundation needs to be strong, but in the digital economy, in digital supply chains, the foundation also has to be fluid, which is sort of unnatural to think about. But when we look at products, particularly the network products, they have to operate as a platform. Right, and that is the foundation upon which all these digital interactions happen, right? Whether it's an IoT transaction or interaction, whether it's human to human, or whether it's human to machine. And so embedding agility into the core of our network and the edge of our network, such that any of those user experiences, those user preferences can be enabled. That's where all of our intellectual capital and all of our investments go. But then the next step to make that consumable is really important. The reason that the hyperscalers and cloud in general have become such enablers to the modern enterprise is because they're easy to do business with, they're easy to consume those services, and it's democratized compute and storage and data analytics, and the network is on that journey, and it has been on that journey. That's really the difference, is how you can consume those services in an elegant and more contemporary way that takes friction out of the conversation, right? So it becomes more orchestrated rather than a very sort of binary transaction.
So when you said the word democratize, that's the last word I think about when I think about the network environment. In the old days, it was locked down, it was hardware dependent, it was, oh, there come those network guys, they're going to control our project.
Monolithic, lots of words we've heard about the network for sure.
So
Always a problem. If something's broken,
It's always the network. Guilty until proven innocent, for sure.
So how are you changing the companies you work with, their mindset? Are you seeing them transition to this more, and I'll let you describe it, what the network of the future is looking like, and what are you seeing in getting them in that journey?
Yeah, so we're seeing a vast continuum of where enterprises are on that journey. You'll hear from Vince what the forefront of that journey looks like, but we see customers across the globe that are in all parts of that journey as well. Where there's really been a lot of progress over the last 5 years is understanding what's happening across the network infrastructure, understanding at a more granular level the application flows, particularly the ones that are most critical to business processes, and then prioritizing those across the network, rather than just kind of the traditional schema from 10 plus years ago of I'm going to take the best route and I'm going to hope everything's okay. And so to do that, it requires a ton of visibility into what's actually happening at the application layer and at the user layer. Where there's opportunity for improvement is to build agility into the infrastructure that then takes that information and acts upon it, right? So the ability to really think about being cloud native in the functions that run the network, right? Whether it's that SD-WAN capability that tells packets where to go, whether it's security functions, the experience on a wireless network in a building, all those types of things. That's really where there's a ton of opportunity for the next iteration of what enterprises are doing. How we're helping, for us, it's been really simple to focus on the signal versus the noise and try to get the noise out of the conversation. And we've done that through creating a couple of frameworks that we use in pretty much all of our conversations globally with our enterprise customers. One is around application enablement, right? What are the key things, the basic things, the fundamental principles that are required for an application to perform at a peak level? And then focusing on those things. That helps us identify technical debt on the journey to what we want that application performance to look like. And then the second framework is around what a network as a platform looks like. How do you deconstruct that into the layers that embed agility into the enterprise infrastructure from end to end, and then set a journey to realize the delivery of those services and those capabilities.
So Vince, you probably experienced some of this in working with Verizon and other partners. And I know you've went through a huge transformation, 2020-ish, moving to cloud out of your on-prem data centers. What did your leadership team have to do to get the organization to think differently, to and more of this end-to-end integrated approach that was described here?
Yeah, so Dan talked about the fact that, you made the comment, a lot of times network is getting in the way of projects. Probably about 7 years ago, as we decided to make the journey to go to the cloud, I actually wanted the network to be an enabler of the business as opposed to a roadblock. So as we started going on that path, I instituted an idea, what I call, a lot of people talk about architecture, I talk about architecture flexibility. And what I meant by that is that as we were going to the cloud, we had to forecast where we thought we were going to be 3 to 5 years from now. Who were we going to be connecting to, what cloud providers we're going to be using, how were we going to enable a network infrastructure that supported rapid application deployment within the cloud. So as part of that, we leveraged kind of a dual strategy because Daniel talked about the fact that there are this breadth of how people connect. So we had the need to be able to connect anything from the internet anywhere. We had the need from some people that we had to have private lines that had static IP addresses. So the way that we went about doing it is we took a look at where we're going to be in the cloud and say, I need some geographic resiliency. I need the ability to connect to any cloud anywhere. So we created a network infrastructure that did that to enable us to connect to multi-cloud as well as multi-tenant across multiple regions. We also went on an SD-WAN journey to say, how are we going to start transforming how we look at the edge and how we route traffic? So by leveraging the SD-WAN, what it did is it's now given us the ability to have not only really end-to-end communications that we can do across whatever medium, whether it's MPLS or just straight IPsec tunnels. We're able to do it in a very secure manner and quickly. So as you start to think about the evolution of network, it's really less now about boxes and where they are and how you virtualize that connectivity in a very quick manner. And so when we looked at it, when we started on this journey, I've been at CapitalOne for 27 years. Network was always behind where the business was going and where the applications. As we moved to the cloud and we started to look 3 to 5 years out, we actually transformed that such that the network was actually ahead of the applications. We were waiting for applications to become cloud ready to move. The network was already in place so that whatever they wanted to do, I talked about that flexible architecture, we would be able to support what they needed to do, whether it was in the cloud or talking to a third party, and we could do it in days as opposed to months.
So I think one key lesson I've just heard is having that network team, network stakeholders really look ahead and get ahead of the game and have that layer ready for when all this is coming versus lagging, which I think you said.
Yeah, it's really all about understanding where your business is going. A lot of times, again, being here for a while, traditionally think, network, we're going to keep it this way. It was really a change in mindset of where is the business going and what do we need to do to support that business as opposed to the opposite.
Andy, you lead enterprise technology. I believe you deal a lot with the applications of the enterprise. Mm-hmm. And given this, I'd say, complexity of network, cloud, now in the mix that help determine how the applications will be distributed, developed, and placed out there in the ecosystem, what types of complexity is that adding to your operation?
Well, I mean, look at it from a couple of ways, and this goes hand in hand with moving to the cloud. The first is the application team is now going to carry some responsibility for how the network is set up, because not necessarily the wide network, but certainly the network inside around their application, and so this is driving the need for more infrastructure type skills on the application teams to manage the environments in the cloud, because it is pushing out that management. On the other side, from a capability standpoint, it's important for the application teams to know what's possible. So what can I do? How can I get an application to perform? What are the capabilities in the network so I can incorporate that in how I design the application, or even how I try to put in capabilities. So you want to know generally about it, so am I planning out what I can do? And then finally, there's kind of the debugging side of it. So, the groups I manage, we have a couple of different streaming applications, primarily B2B. Not the big bulk stuff is separate, but we want to give a very good experience for doing streams all around the world, because that's who we're selling to, is broadcasters, streamers in all geographies. And we had going back 2 years, we had to cancel our in-person sales event. And so we didn't have a really high-performing event out virtually. And we learned that we had to spend a lot of time figuring out, what do we want, CloudFront or Akamai? And with Akamai out there, how do we get it configured properly? So the application teams ended up learning an awful lot about networks and edge computing so they could get the application to perform right.
You mentioned in our pre-discussion one use case that I thought was kind of interesting, and it relates to 5G. It's when filming out on site and potentially leveraging 5G to send the data when you're out in the middle of nowhere and so on.
Well, that's one thing that we've talked
being
about
aware
as
of that,
a possible application for it. So right now on the lot, there are productions from all different production companies that work on the lot. And one of the services in running the back lot that we provide is you get your own little secure network on the lot. Well, what if we could also do that with a 5G spot network around a production? So they would have highly secure, highly performant network on site for moving the content around, for sending the dailies back, for all the other stuff that they need to do. So that's not something we've done yet, but it's one of the most promising ideas I think we came across for 5G.
The fact is, being aware of that capability, and then the ideas start coming for things you're not even doing yet, right? Okay, Naresh, in your work with various clients, are you seeing this progression towards this kind of thinking, of more the end-to-end frameworks that?
Absolutely. In fact, I want to go back to what Vince said. I like the fact that they were imagining what need to happen 5 years from now and put that in place. And coming back to your discussion with Andy about the 5G, this, I believe it's called the enterprise network. And one of the value props from that is, yes, we have Wi-Fi today, we can have that, but the 5G gives, allows manufacturing entities, et cetera, to be able to, today we have cement walls and steel and all these things that block regular Wi-Fi. The 5G allows you to enable to work around that. And in today's day and age with this whole edge computing, collecting the data, pushing it forward, you need minimum latency, right? That nanosecond thing that Bart talked about. And that's where I believe the 5G can really help. I just want to add one more comment. When Bart mentioned the nano computing, and the light turns green, you don't move in New Jersey, well, that was me behind him hitting the horn. So I just want to get that on the table. I'm from New York, so.
New Jersey.
New Jersey. Well, yes, same thing.
Next question for you, Naresh. Now, turning to the second element, the cloud side. So we have, all of the IoT, edge computing, lots of data, right, can shift around from the edge to the core to business partners, and a lot of cloud computing potentially in the mix, right, at the edge and at the core. A lot of new opportunity, right? So how are organizations rethinking their cloud strategy to address all these new opportunities on where to process their apps, where to place the data? It's a lot more complex than maybe a few years ago.
Absolutely. I go back to the, several years ago when people talk about going to the cloud, we can save some money, it's about storage. Given this crisis, I think really woke a lot of people up to think of this differently. Leveraging, to your point, the hybrid cloud, you have some data sitting, whether it's Google or AWS or wherever, leveraging those technologies. So the data is there, and then you could talk about edge computing. I'll use an example, in the manufacturing space where somebody shared this thought with me that, they have a video actually recording what's coming off a production line, able to tell if something was defective and take some action using AI. Now, think of all that data that's coming through. How do you get that over through, in a manufacturing environment, through a Wi-Fi network to make a decision, using whether it's 5G and then the edge computing devices to make that decision and enable that. I was also talking to somebody here earlier today, cannot name, but they were in the Air Force, and the plane during one of the wars we had recently, with the plane came and there was a problem, and he couldn't, he had to completely disassemble the whole plane to try to figure out what the problem was. Now, if back then we had the ability to have an edge computing device able to collect the data, analyze it, and give him that information so he can make an effective decision, or communicate back with somebody else, through the network to get him an answer. So it took them days to figure out what the real problem was. So there's a real opportunity here for enterprises to start to leverage these technologies and take it forward.
Andy, you mentioned in your opening that use case around using cloud for processing the different steps of the filmmaking process. Can you give us a little more background on what that looks like and how's cloud contributing?
Well, so a little bit of history on it. So you think back when we're shooting on film, and the film would come out of the camera and get processed. Then the film would go for the dailies in the theater, then going to be edited. Well, then, okay, we started digitizing the film so we could do digital editing. And then instead of doing film, we started doing, capturing it digitally, and so hard drives started moving around, or LTO tapes, and now it's network, so the files are moving around. But in the end, all these workflows, from production to post-production to all the prep work you need to do with localization, like dubbing and subtitles, all of those workflows, they pretty much behave like they did when they were film. Only now we're moving files instead of moving film and audio tape and stuff. And I think the light has gone on. In fact, there's an organization called Movie Labs. It's a joint venture amongst the major studios. And they've got a vision for the future, Movie Labs 2030. You can look it up. It's a pretty interesting document. But it's a comprehensive vision of how things would operate in the future. And the core of it is that instead of the content going to be serviced and then sent back, is the content stays in one place and the services come to the content. So if I need an audio conform or color correction on it, well, okay, I have a vendor, a Deluxe, who does the service, but they just go in and they get the content out of my storage in the cloud. Maybe they need to produce a new asset. Okay, they produce it and they put it in my cloud. So it's not, the assets are staying in one place in our control and the services are coming to it. It's a very different paradigm. And it's also something I think that can work very effectively to reduce duplication of assets, increase agility in production, which generally goes into more creativity and not necessarily cost savings. But from the very beginning, I'm keeping content in one place, so I know where it is, I know its quality. And it's really only going to be possible with the technologies that are out there today.
Yeah, it's taking that low value activities.
And again, it's back to your comment about silos. We've been doing things the same way because we always did them that way. But we're now at a point where the technology is going to enable us to do it enough differently that will break down those silos. I think there's also organizational changes across the entertainment industry with the windows collapsing, it's theatrical to streaming, doing all very quickly, that's also driving the change.
Yeah, I would think there's other data production type industries where that concept could be applied in a similar way. Maybe not film, music, anything that produces large bulks of data.
Engineering designs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Vince, can you tell us a little more about your cloud journey, and especially how it related to some of the business transformations and customer experience transformations, and how you leverage the cloud to address those?
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief. So we pretty much completed our cloud journey. I'd say we completed our cloud journey maybe a couple years ago, actually during the pandemic, when we shut down our data centers during the pandemic. And really the biggest thing we got out of it was the ability of applications to more dynamically get coded differently, and how they could support rapid deployment of new features that customers would want. And a lot of that also drove how we started thinking about the core cloud infrastructure. So when we first went there, most everything was on like EC2 instances in Amazon. We're since now doing a move to more serverless, where our goal is to start having everything serverless, whether it's on Kubernetes clusters or Lambda functions. And the interesting part there is it helps us, again, streamline how we do things. It also helps standardize, and that's actually one of the key things about the cloud is when we start talking about application deployments, whether it's a network function or an application, the ability to standardize both on how we deploy it, both from a capability standpoint, from also a security standpoint, is making us way more agile in the way that we actually deploy applications in a timely manner and do it at scale and very securely. So that's really the next chapter in our world, is really how we start thinking about securing serverless applications differently, because in the traditional world, okay, everything goes across a wire, we have a firewall, something we can put in front of it. With serverless, it acts very differently, and that's one of the things we're looking at now is how do we actually look forward into an all serverless type environment, and how that's going to look in the next 3 to 5 years.
Mm-hmm. So have you, as part of this process, the containerization of this development, brought the security team into the design up front as part of that?
Yeah, that's one of the key things that we did, and we're going through that journey right now, so we definitely don't have all the answers. And like an earlier panel, somebody made the statement, we're going to make mistakes. That's kind of where the architectural flexibility comes in, is that we limit the damage of the mistakes, But the core way we're looking at it differently now is that we're not looking at solutions from a security standpoint, we're looking at capabilities.
Yep.
Meaning, we're taking an application flow or a connectivity flow and say, what do we need in order to make sure that this application is secure and safe? And then we'll figure out what technologies we lay on top of it, because they're evolving so quickly, and there's not even any good solutions out there on how you fully secure a serverless application.
You know, turning to Verizon and your role here, you know, in many of the sessions today, yesterday, and the use cases described here, obviously point to, you know, the edge, processing in devices, analytics occurring in the edge and at the core, data crossing business partners and in the ecosystem, and the cloud mixed in there as well. So how do you, in your products, your solutions, what's your role in that whole ecosystem, architecture, and services that you provide?
There are a few areas there. The earlier panel on just data in general touched on a topic that I think is really important. One is kind of the what, where, and how of applications, right? What is the application doing? Where is it doing it? And how is that data that is being generated relevant to me? And I use the word application loosely, because this could be an industrial control process. It could be, you know, editing. It could be, you know, a customer transaction. It could be any number of things. But looking at it through that lens, and then thinking about how you decouple the application components and strategically place them at various parts of the digital supply chain. You know, if it's something that really requires low latency, you know, a safety application in a manufacturing facility, you don't want to be sending that all the way back to, you know, the core cloud and then back, because, you know, milliseconds matter in that instance. If it's an ERP application, yeah, ship it off to cloud. But I also think it's important to think about not shipping the data anywhere if you don't have to. Right? There's obviously applications there for data sovereignty once you get outside the US, but just, you know, in terms of protecting data, that's super important. So there's a couple of areas where Verizon plays in this space. The connectivity one is the obvious piece, right? And we talked a little bit about, you know, kind of the wide area piece, but where the evolution and opportunity for enterprises is at the edge. And from a connectivity perspective, Naresh, you talked about 5G as it compares to Wi-Fi. You know, some of the characteristics of the spectrum that make it uniquely beneficial to enterprises, where you can have hundreds of thousands of devices in a smaller area without interference, with segmentation, micro-segmentation to keep, you know, certain processes apart, you know, for security purposes or for interference purposes. That becomes critically important. And doesn't have to be limited to a building, right? We've seen it in shipyards. You know, Bharat was here earlier, right, and was talking about that. We've seen that one of our largest customers abroad, you know, we're deploying private networks for that use. We've deployed it in caves, right? And then we also deployed it in buildings and campuses and things of that nature, right? So thinking about how you can leverage a very different type of connectivity at the edge becomes really important. And then edge compute is something that we are sort of leading the industry on, obviously in partnership with all of our hyperscaler partners, right? So AWS, Azure, and GCP, you know, are helping us build this, you know, diversified and tiered platform, if you will, so you can run workloads where they should be run, as opposed to having to ship everything else back to somewhere else. So the wrapper around all of that is, how do you secure this information, right? So part of it is making sure that it only has to be transmitted when it has to be transmitted. But when it is in motion, right, how do you secure it? How do you protect it? How do you take data from our broader global network? I don't remember the exact specific, but somewhere about 60% of the world's internet traffic hits our backbone at some point or another. So we have a ton of visibility, not only into existing threat vectors, but emerging threat vectors, and can leverage that data to help enterprises protect themselves. So kind of the entire ecosystem is where we can help.
And that kind of points to our third layer, and that's the software definition of all of this complexity. And I'd like to first ask Vince and Daniel, you know, this is a topic that I'm still learning about, because it seems to be changing very rapidly, where you can software define all these elements. What's your experience? What are the things you're seeing happening? Just how far does it go in terms of software defined to everything? Is that a true statement?
So hopefully it'll be a true statement. I'd say it's still a journey in process. I would definitely say if we look at our on-premise locations like traditional campuses, That's not nearly as mature in the software-defined space, still kind of relies on the old, okay, here we're going to have a big honking switch or something else like that. But as we look, getting away from that into the edge and into the cloud, we've just finished our deployment of all of our software-defined WAN, so we have software-defined WAN everywhere, which I talked about standardization. It now gives us the ability to templatize everything. It gives us the ability to route traffic how we want, whether that's directly to the internet for applications that we deem secure, whether it's straight to the cloud, to a third party. Within the cloud, we're actually in the process of trying to figure out how we do really as applications as code across the network. So you talked about how, like right now, we've had to have a lot of application developers understand infrastructure. We're actually trying to use the power of software-defined networking and infrastructure to actually remove that burden from the application developers. We actually want the application developers not to worry about infrastructure, not to worry about the network, but worry about the application, the code. They develop their code, they develop their parameters around that. We're going to try and abstract that such that we can then feed in the application flows and what they need, abstract that and tie automation into the network so that we can deploy the security stack and connectivity that they need without them even understanding how it's happening.
Mm-hmm. And we lean on our own journey because we've had to transform our own network to be able to remain relevant. 3 commas worth of capital per year to drive extreme, SDN deployments, first in the core of the network so that we have embedded agility to react to, the needs of the business. A common reference point we like to use is that our busiest day of the year pre-pandemic was always Mother's Day because everybody calls mom, right? But post-pandemic, every day is the same traffic levels that we had on a Mother's Day pre-pandemic. But the network never missed a beat because we had embedded that agility into the core, right? And so then embedding that same agility at the edge and extending it into enterprise networks is the next step. I think we're only scratching the surface of the benefit that SDN can bring to the digital enterprise.
So Andy, you're probably a recipient or stakeholder in that whole software-defined ecosystem. Do you see it actually playing out the way it should, the promises and the...
Yeah, well, so a few years back when we moved out of consolidated data centers, we went from a traditional wired firewall with firewall rules, segmented data center network to an entirely software-defined network inside the data center. And that was an adventure for both the network team and for the application teams, and there was a lot of mutual learning because you went to a situation like where you bring up a new server in the new environment and it doesn't talk to anything, right? Or except whatever the default one connection is, and you got to know how you're talking. But coming out of it, we now have in software how each application needs to communicate, and so we can recreate that in another place if we need to. And I think maybe build on some of what you said is if as we get down this path and that that the entire infrastructure is defined in code like my application is defined in code, I get a lot more agility because I can move faster, and I get an awful lot better security and resiliency because I know that I can take it down and recreate it from scratch, and I know it's clean. If it gets compromised, I can get rid of it and create a new one right away. So. I think it's also important that the network and the application teams work closely together because you need to, as you say, you've got to build out that framework ahead of the applications, but you've got to have some level of understanding, right? I think you need to have some level of understanding on the app teams because otherwise they'll just create problems for the network that they don't need to.
So it sounds like some additional complexity and investment in that relieves you later down the road and frees
up. It's a collaborative thing.
The operation much more, yeah. We are out of time. So what I'd like to do is we have 4 great panelists here. If you could provide one ending thought for our audience, they could take away 4 key learnings here or recommendations as we end the session.
Yeah, I'll
Sorry
start.
To put you on the spot.
Okay. So I think it comes down to, going back to what Kevin brought up earlier, it's imagination. Think of the future, think where you need to be, and get commitment from your executives that you're going to drive value for the business. It's not just about IT spend. This technology is going to help them transform. Based on this crisis, people have now realized they need to think differently. So I think they need to take advantage of that.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm probably not going to be original because I'm going to build on that. But it's, to me, as I look back, it was thinking about technology for the sake of technology doesn't always serve you the best way, because you start doing things just because it's cool to do it. It's not necessarily where the business is going. So truly understanding where your business is going, and then the role that technology has in that to actually be an enabler as opposed to just something that's out there. That was probably the most critical learning that I had personally over the last 7 years as we went down this cloud journey, is that it didn't matter what I wanted to do technically. It mattered where the business was going and what I could drive technically to actually support that.
Let me build on that, because I would say that there are probably a lot of problems we have out there that the solution exists, and we assume it isn't there because we were not able to do it before. And I mean, just in the example of we recently deployed SAP HANA in the cloud, and it's just infrastructure as a service, right? Just the most basic tier of it. But we were able to move so fast, turn on a dime, do things we could never have done. It materially reduced the length of the project, and that was not even beginning to scratch the surface of all the capabilities that are available out there today.
I would just encourage people to push the envelope on what you think is possible in terms of really embedding the extreme agility needed for the modern enterprise to survive and remain relevant. A lot of things that we said pre-pandemic were not possible are now everyday occurrences. And so make sure that you're being aggressive with what you're expecting out of that network as a platform, that it's being a full participant in the agile stack that the modern enterprise works on, and where these applications are developed.
Yeah, I like that word, extreme agility, because again, when I look at the sessions today, the omniverse, metaverse, preparing for that, because it is coming. And to someone's earlier point, at different levels, right? Each industry will leverage it in different ways, but I think looking ahead to really getting to that extreme agility to make that metaverse happen in your own way is a key thing to start looking at. Yep. So with that, we've ended the session here. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Henry.